A billionaire tired of empty admiration sets a quiet test to uncover what truly lies in the hearts of the women around him. But when the results unfold, he discovers far more than he bargained for, and far more than money could ever buy. Hello family, welcome to Folktales by Imzi. Please subscribe and like, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The city stretched beneath the penthouse windows like a sea of diamonds, each light flickering against the velvet night. Alexander Grant leaned against the glass wall, his reflection staring back at him. Sharp suit, perfect tie, but eyes that carried no spark. The world knew him as the untouchable billionaire who had conquered tech before 30. Yet in the silence of his sky-high kingdom, he felt less like a king and more like a prisoner, trapped by the very riches everyone envied. A glass of wine stood untouched on the marble counter, its ruby color glowing under the chandelier. He had bought the vineyard, the building, even the chandelier itself on a whim. Everything in his life was easily acquired, except the one thing that seemed forever out of reach: genuine love. He remembered the last woman who had claimed to adore him. She had whispered forever, while sliding diamond rings into her purse, purchased with his card. When he ended things, she didn't cry. She simply called another wealthy man. That memory still left a bitter taste on his tongue. Alexander straightened, pulling a sleek, black credit card from his pocket. It caught the light like a mirror, reflecting his uncertainty back at him. Money had become his cage and his weapon, but tonight it would be his test. He whispered into the empty room, as though to convince himself. 3 women, 3 choices, and the truth will finally show itself. A smile touched his lips, not of joy but of challenge. Somewhere in his heart, a fragile hope flickered. That maybe, just maybe, one of them would see beyond the card and into the man holding it. The next evening, Alexander arranged to meet Veronica at an exclusive rooftop bar where only the elite were granted entry. The air was warm, perfumed with roses that had been placed on every table, and the skyline shimmered like a crown of diamonds. A jazz trio played softly in the corner, their notes weaving a languid spell over the city below. Veronica swept in nearly 20 minutes late, though Alexander had expected nothing less. Her entrance was deliberate, every step designed to capture attention. She wore a crimson silk dress that clung to her figure like liquid fire, her blonde hair styled into loose waves that caught the light. Men turned their heads. Women whispered behind their champagne glasses. Veronica basked in it all, smiling as though the world were her stage. "Darling," she cooed, leaning down to press a lingering kiss against his cheek before settling gracefully into the velvet seat across from him. Her perfume was intoxicating, expensive, and heavy like flowers cut too soon. "You've kept me waiting all week. I thought you'd forgotten about me." Alexander studied her carefully. There was always an edge of performance in Veronica's words, as though she spoke not to him, but to an invisible audience. He motioned for the waiter, who immediately poured her a glass of the bar's most expensive champagne. "I wanted tonight to be different," Alexander said slowly, sliding his hand into his jacket pocket. He drew out the sleek, black credit card and laid it on the table between them. Under the golden glow of the overhead lantern, it gleamed like a challenge. Her eyes widened, not with confusion, not with surprise, but with recognition. The gleam in her gaze was instant, sharp. She reached out, her manicured nails brushing against the card, though she paused just long enough to mask eagerness with charm. "And what's this supposed to mean?" she asked, her lips curving into a smile. "It means," Alexander said, holding her gaze, "that I want you to buy whatever your heart desires. No restrictions. No rules." Veronica let out a musical laugh, the kind that sparkled in the air, but rang hollow in his ears. "Alexander, you always know how to spoil a woman," she teased, though her hand closed around the card with the speed of someone who feared it might vanish if she hesitated. She slipped it into her clutch with the elegance of a magician concealing a trick. "You don't even want to ask why?" Alexander asked, his voice calm, though his eyes searched hers for something. Anything beyond the practiced gleam. "Why?" She leaned forward, placing her delicate fingers on his sleeve. Her nails traced idle patterns against the fine fabric of his suit. "Because you're generous." Because you adore me. And because you love seeing me shine, don't you? Her gaze locked on his, daring him to deny it. Alexander swirled the deep red wine in his glass, watching the liquid catch the light. He offered her a smile, polite but unreadable. I'll make sure to find something unforgettable, she whispered, her voice low and sultry. Something that reminds you every time you look at me, of what you gave. But Alexander wasn't thinking of what she would buy. He was thinking of what she hadn't asked. Not once had she considered the meaning behind the gesture, the man behind the wealth. To her, the card was not a test. It was a gift, a confirmation of what she already believed, that his riches were hers for the taking. As the jazz trio slid into another melancholy tune, Alexander felt the first quiet note of disappointment echo inside his chest. The game had only just begun, but already, he suspected the ending to this chapter was written long before he placed the card on the table. The following afternoon, Alexander chose a quieter setting. No glittering rooftop bar, no crowd of admirers. Instead, he met Julia at a private cafe tucked into a side street lined with autumn trees. The place was discreet, the kind of establishment that served coffee in porcelain cups and played classical piano at a volume just low enough to invite conversation. Julia arrived precisely on time. She was nothing like Veronica, no silk gowns, no dramatic entrances. She wore a tailored blazer over a crisp white blouse, her hair tied back neatly, her expression sharp and alert. There was no denying her beauty, but it was the kind that came wrapped in control, polished by ambition. "Alex," she greeted, sliding into the chair across from him. "You look tired. Meetings all morning." "Something like that," he replied, lifting his cup. Her perceptiveness never failed to impress him. Julia was one of the few people in his orbit who never tiptoed around him. She treated him not like a trophy, but like a chess piece, something to strategize around, to understand, and perhaps to use. He waited until the waiter left before placing the black card on the small round table. It looked almost out of place here, against the pale wood and porcelain cups. Julia raised an eyebrow, her lips tugging into the faintest smile. "This isn't usually how you start a conversation." "Humor me," Alexander said softly. "Take it. Buy whatever you want. No restrictions." She studied him, her dark eyes narrowing just slightly as if she were weighing the trap behind the offer. "That's a dangerous sentence to say to a woman," she replied, though she reached for the card without hesitation. She turned it between her fingers, the black surface catching the soft cafe light. "And what exactly are you hoping to learn from this little experiment?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. Alexander held her gaze but gave no answer. He wanted to see what she would reveal without guidance. Julia smirked, sliding the card into her slim leather wallet. "Fine. If you want to know, I won't waste time pretending I don't already have ideas." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I've been planning to expand my portfolio. Paris Fashion Week is coming up, and the people I need to meet will be there. Flights, accommodations, networking dinners, it isn't cheap. But with the right wardrobe, the right presence," she let the thought linger, her confidence painting the rest of the picture. Alexander listened in silence, though inside his chest tightened. There was nothing frivolous about Julia's choice. Her purchases weren't about luxury or indulgence, but about power. Every dollar she would spend was an investment in her own climb. She wasn't blinded by wealth. She was calculating how to wield it. "You'll be proud of me," she added finally, her tone almost playful. "One day, when I'm running empires beside you, you'll remember this conversation as the beginning of it all." For a moment, Alexander allowed himself to imagine it. Julia at his side, sharp and commanding, the world bending before their combined strength. But then another image crept in, Veronica's laughter from the night before, shallow and glittering, and the question that gnawed at him. Was ambition any closer to love than vanity? The waiter returned with a tray of delicate pastries, breaking the tension. Julia picked one up, biting into it with a confident smile. "Consider it an investment, Alex," she said. "An investment in us." Her words were smooth, practiced, almost too perfect. Alexander forced a smile in return, but deep inside, the ache returned, quiet, familiar, insistent. The test was far from over, but he could already feel the weight of disappointment pressing closer with every passing choice. The mansion was unusually quiet that evening. Alexander had dismissed most of the staff early, leaving only the soft hum of the chandeliers and the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. He stood in the library, surrounded by walls of leather-bound books he rarely had time to read, waiting. Claire entered hesitantly, carrying a tray with fresh tea. She was dressed in her simple uniform, hair neatly tied back, eyes lowered as though afraid to intrude on his solitude. Claire had worked for him for nearly 3 years, and in that time she had never overstepped, never lingered, never asked for anything. She was like the quiet thread that held the household together, invisible yet indispensable. "Sir," she said softly, placing the tray on the low table before him. "Will you need anything else tonight?" Alexander studied her for a long moment. There was no polish about Claire, no performance, no sharpness. She was not dazzling like Veronica or ambitious like Julia. She was simply steady, honest, and for reasons he could not explain, that made this part of the test feel heavier than the others. "Sit for a moment," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Claire froze, surprise flickering across her face. She never sat in his presence. Her instinct was to protest, but something in his tone made her obey. She perched lightly on the edge of the chair, hands folded in her lap, her gaze still lowered. Alexander reached into his pocket, pulling out the black card. He laid it on the table between them. Against the polished wood, it looked sharper, darker, more final than it had in the hands of the others. "I want you to take this," he said quietly. "Buy whatever you want. No limits." Claire's eyes lifted then, wide with disbelief. She looked from the card to his face, as though searching for a trick. "Sir, I couldn't," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not for me." "It is tonight," Alexander insisted, his voice calm but firm. "I gave it to the others. Now I'm giving it to you. Take it." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached forward, but she pulled them back before touching it. "Why me? I'm just your maid." The word struck him harder than he expected. Just your maid. He wanted to tell her she was more than that, though he didn't yet know how to explain what he felt. Instead, he leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Because I said so," he replied simply. Reluctantly, Claire picked up the card, holding it as though it were something fragile, dangerous. She didn't smile. She didn't laugh. She only whispered, "Thank you, sir," before clutching it tightly to her chest, as though she feared it might disappear if she loosened her grip. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then Claire rose quickly, dipping her head in respect, and excused herself. The door closed softly behind her, leaving Alexander alone with the echo of her words. He poured himself a cup of tea, but didn't drink. Instead, he stared at the steam curling upward and felt a strange unease settle in his chest. He had expected excitement, greed, or at the very least curiosity. But Claire's reaction had been something entirely different. Not desire, not ambition, something quieter, something he couldn't yet name. And for the first time since he began his test, Alexander wondered if the answer he was seeking would come not in diamonds or power, but in the silence of a woman who called herself just his maid. Days passed before Alexander finally allowed himself to look at the statements. He sat alone in his study late one night, the fire casting long shadows across the room. A folder of crisp white pages lay before him, each one a ledger of choices, his test reduced to numbers and names. He began with Veronica. The total nearly made him laugh, though there was no joy in the sound. $250,000, gone in a storm of designer handbags, glittering shoes, and a spa retreat that promised eternal youth. He could almost hear her voice echoing in his mind. Every woman deserves the best. He moved on to Julia's page. Her spending was smaller but no less sharp. Nearly $180,000, tailored suits, luxury luggage, first-class tickets to Paris. The purchases were strategic, cold, deliberate. She had called it an investment. An investment in herself, and in what she imagined us might mean. Alexander set those statements aside, his jaw tight. And then he reached for the last page. Claire's. The numbers were so small they almost seemed misplaced. Barely over $1,000. He leaned closer, scanning the list. Children's clothing. School supplies. Boxes of groceries. Medicine. Not for her. Not even a single item that suggested indulgence. His brow furrowed as he read the delivery address. It wasn't a store. It wasn't a boutique. It was an orphanage. Alexander's hand froze on the page. He knew the place, a weathered building on the outskirts of the city, forgotten by most, where children with no family survived on charity. He had passed by once years ago, never giving it more than a passing glance. But Claire had given it more. She had given them everything. The firelight flickered against his face as the weight of the truth sank in. While Veronica clothed herself in silk and Julia clothed herself in power, Claire had clothed children. While they looked to him as a provider of wealth, she had used his gift to provide life. He set the paper down slowly, his chest tightening. It wasn't anger he felt. It wasn't disappointment. It was something heavier, something that pressed into him until it hurt. It was heartbreak. Not because of what she spent, but because of what she refused to spend on herself. For the first time in years, Alexander Grant, billionaire, conqueror of industries, sat alone in his grand study and felt utterly small. The next morning, Alexander left his mansion without his driver, without his entourage, without warning. He drove himself through the gray dawn, past the gleaming towers of the city, until the glass and steel gave way to cracked pavements and weary streets. The address from the receipt burned in his pocket, pulling him onward like a thread he could not cut. The orphanage stood at the end of a quiet lane, its brick walls worn, its paint peeling. A rusted swing creaked in the yard, carrying the laughter of children who had learned to find joy even in scarcity. Alexander parked at the curb and sat for a moment, his chest tight. He had visited countless charities, written checks with more zeros than he could remember. But he had never stepped into a place like this with no cameras, no headlines, no speeches. When he finally pushed open the gate, he was met by the sight of Claire. She was kneeling in the grass, her uniform replaced by a simple cardigan and skirt, her hair tied back loosely. She was surrounded by children who clung to her hands, her arms, her laughter. She didn't see him at first. Her attention was wholly theirs. She tied a shoelace for one boy, brushed crumbs from another's cheek, and cradled a little girl against her chest as though she were her own. For a moment, Alexander couldn't breathe. Then one of the children spotted him. "Claire!" the boy cried, tugging her sleeve. "Someone's here." Claire looked up, and when her eyes met Alexander's, her face drained of color. She rose quickly, sending the children to play before walking toward him, her steps hesitant. "Sir," she said softly, her voice trembling, "you shouldn't be here." "I followed the receipts," Alexander replied. His tone was calm, but beneath it ran an ache that made his words heavy. "You spent everything on this place." Claire lowered her gaze, wringing her hands together. "They needed it more than I ever could. The children, they're sick, some of them. The school didn't have enough supplies. The cupboards were empty. Her voice cracked. I couldn't look at that card and think only of myself." Silence stretched between them. The laughter of the children floated in the background, sharp against the weight of the moment. "You grew up here, didn't you?" Alexander asked quietly. Her eyes flickered, widening at the truth he had guessed. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "This was my home before I ever worked for you. I come back every week. It's the only family I have." Alexander's throat tightened. He had expected excuses, maybe embarrassment. What he found instead was a quiet, unwavering truth. Claire hadn't bought jewels or dresses, or even the smallest token for herself. She had chosen others, chosen love, without hesitation. And standing there, amidst peeling paint and broken swings, Alexander Grant felt something inside him unravel. This woman, his maid, as she called herself, had shown him what none of his wealth had ever been able to buy. Compassion. Sacrifice. A love so simple, so pure, it shattered the walls he had built around his heart. And for the first time in years, he realized how poor he truly was. That night, Alexander returned to his mansion, but it no longer felt like home. The marble floors gleamed, the chandeliers sparkled, and the city lights poured in through the windows like molten gold. But none of it touched him. The silence was heavier than ever, pressing in on him until he could hardly breathe. He poured himself a drink and set it down untouched. In his mind, he still saw Claire in the orphanage yard, kneeling among children who adored her, her smile tender, her hands steady. She had been radiant, not in silk or jewels, but in something far rarer, kindness. And the memory hurt. He thought of Veronica draped in crimson silk, laughing as she swept away his card. He thought of Julia's sharp ambition, her voice silky with promises of empire. Both of them had taken, without hesitation. But Claire had given. And not once to herself. The ache in his chest deepened. All his life, he had been admired, envied, desired for his fortune. Yet when he stripped everything down to a single gesture, his wealth had only revealed truths he had been too blind to see. He leaned against the window, staring at the glittering skyline. "What am I doing?" he whispered to the empty room. His reflection in the glass looked back at him, tailored, flawless, yet hollow. For the first time in years, Alexander felt ashamed. Ashamed of how long it had taken him to recognize real worth. Ashamed that Claire, who earned so little, carried more richness in her heart than he did in all his accounts combined. His eyes burned, though he fought it. Billionaires weren't supposed to break. But that night, Alexander Grant's heart cracked open. Not from betrayal, not from greed, but from the devastating realization that he had mistaken wealth for value and overlooked the quiet treasure living right under his roof. He sank into his leather chair, his hands covering his face. For once, the world's most powerful man felt small, fragile, undone. And it was not his empire that had broken him. It was the choice of a maid who had spent everything on love that wasn't even hers to keep. The next morning dawned pale and quiet, a thin mist curling over the city. Alexander hadn't slept. The night had been a restless cycle of memories, Veronica's laughter, Julia's ambition, and Claire's trembling hands as she whispered, "I couldn't look at that card and think only of myself." By sunrise, his mind was clear. For once, his decisions were not about stocks, mergers, or profit margins. They were about something far rarer and infinitely more fragile. He found Claire in the garden, kneeling among the roses she tended when the house was still. The morning light touched her hair, and for a moment, Alexander simply stood there, watching her with a strange ache in his chest. She wasn't adorned in jewels or silk. Her uniform was plain, her hands dusted with soil. And yet she had never looked more beautiful to him. "Claire," he said softly. She startled, rising quickly, brushing her hands against her apron. "Sir, I didn't know you were awake." "Forgive me, Don't call me sir," he interrupted gently. His voice carried none of its usual command. It was quiet, almost pleading. Claire froze, her brow furrowing. "But you're my employer." Alexander stepped closer. "I've spent years surrounded by people who see only my money. They take, they plan, they perform. And then there's you." His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. "You had the same freedom they did, but you gave it away. Not for yourself. For children who had nothing. Claire, do you know what that did to me?" Her eyes lowered, and she whispered, "I'm sorry if I disappointed you." "Disappointed me?" He let out a strained laugh. "You broke my heart. Not because of what you spent, but because you showed me how small I am compared to you." Tears glimmered in her eyes, though she quickly looked away. "I don't understand." Alexander reached for her hands, still smudged with earth, and held them tightly. "You don't need to. Just know this. I don't want to give you cards or tests or anything that makes you prove yourself. I want to give you me. All of me. Because you've already given me what no one else has." The garden was silent, but for the rustle of leaves. Claire's lips parted in disbelief, her breath catching. "You can't mean that. You are not just anything," Alexander said firmly, his eyes locking on hers. "You are the only woman who's ever seen beyond the billionaire. And I would be a fool to let you go." For a long moment, Claire stood frozen, her hands trembling in his. Then, slowly, her fingers tightened around his, as though she, too, had been holding back something fragile and afraid. The mist lifted with the rising sun, and in that quiet garden, Alexander Grant, billionaire, conqueror, untouchable, found what all his wealth had failed to buy, a love unmeasured by price, untainted by greed, and rooted in the simplest of truths. And for the first time in his life, his heart felt whole.